Ethan Walker, a former U.S. Navy SEAL, had learned to live quietly after the war until one broken bark carried on the wind stopped him cold. Beneath an overpass, he found a scene so cruel it defied reason. A German shepherd mother and her puppy heads, sealed in plastic bodies bound tight with rope, abandoned beside the railroad tracks, like a sentence already passed. If stories of courage, compassion, and second chances matter to you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because some moments change lives forever, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Snow had fallen early over Missoula, Montana, thinning into a gray slush that glazed the abandoned rail yards and turned the late afternoon light into something dull and metallic, as if the sky itself had been forged from cold steel. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of that forgotten place, hands buried in the pockets of a worn military jacket, whose dark green fabric still held the shape of discipline even after years of civilian silence. He was 38 tall in a way that came from posture rather than height. Alone shoulders squared by habit face carved with sharp cheekbones and a narrow jaw that always seemed clenched whether he spoke or not. A short, uneven beard traced his face dark with threads of premature gray and his eyes steel blue. Alert, restless, belonged to a man who slept lightly and listened even when the world appeared quiet. The war had not left him angry. It had left him watchful. Years as a Navy SEAL had trained his body to respond faster than thought, but it was the final mission, the one where he was ordered to retreat and leave 2 men behind under collapsing fire, that hardened something inside him. Since then, Ethan avoided crowds, avoided explanations, and lived in a rented house on the edge of town, close enough to the mountains that silence could still mean something honest. He had not planned to be near the tracks that evening. He was only walking to clear his head, following the old routes his legs chose when his mind refused to rest. That was when the sound reached him, not loud, not dramatic, but wrong. A muffled, frantic scraping sound followed by a low, broken whine that cut through the wind with the precision of a blade. Ethan stopped. His breathing slowed automatically, his head tilting slightly, every sense narrowing toward the noise. He followed it past rusted signal posts and weeds frozen into crooked shapes until he saw them. 2 shapes lay near the rail, so still they almost blended into the gravel. At first his mind tried to reject what his eyes were telling him. Then he stepped closer, and the details arranged themselves into horror. A German shepherd mother, her coat once rich sable, now dulled with dirt and melted snow, lay on her side, her head completely wrapped in a thin plastic bag pulled tight around her muzzle. Thick rope cut into her body, looping her torso and legs with deliberate knots, the kind tied by someone who knew how to make them hold. Beside her was a smaller bundle, a puppy no more than 5 months old, black and tan with oversized paws, bound just as cruelly, its tiny chest jerking beneath the plastic as it fought for air. The mother's body was angled protectively as much as the ropes allowed, her muscles trembling as she strained toward her child, her muffled growls vibrating against the bag in a sound that was not rage but terror held in check by instinct. Ethan felt something cold bloom behind his ribs, a familiar pressure that preceded action. This was not abandonment. This was not neglect. The placement was precise, the distance from the rail measured. Someone had wanted the train to finish what they started. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the low horn of an approaching freight train, its rhythm steady, indifferent, inevitable. Ethan dropped to his knees without hesitation, gravel biting through his jeans, hands already working at the ropes. As his fingers closed around the coarse fibers, memories surged, uninvited hands bound behind his back during a training exercise, gone wrong, the smell of plastic during an extraction where oxygen ran thin, the sound of breathing turning desperate in enclosed spaces, his jaw-tightened teeth grinding as he forced himself to stay present. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low, steady, not because he expected the dogs to understand the words, but because control mattered. The mother's eyes found his through the plastic, deep brown wide, reflecting fear and a fierce, pleading awareness. She did not snap. She did not thrash. She watched him with a focus that broke something open in his chest. The puppy squirmed weakly, a thin, panicked sound escaping its throat, each breath a stolen mercy. Ethan's hand shook once, just once, then steadied as he reached for the knife clipped inside his boot. The train horn sounded again, closer now, vibrating through the rails beneath them, and Ethan knew with absolute clarity that this moment, like so many before, it would not allow him to look away. The freight horn swelled until it filled everything, a living sound that pressed against the chest and demanded an answer. And Ethan Walker answered by cutting. The knife flashed once, twice, sawing through the rope with controlled urgency as gravel bit into his knees and the rails hummed beneath him like a held breath. He started with the puppy because size mattered and time was cruel, slicing the cords around the small body and tearing the plastic free in one practiced motion. The pup gasped a thin, desperate sound, then coughed, lungs stuttering as cold air rushed in, and Ethan tucked the trembling weight against his jacket, anchoring the little heart with the steady drum of his own. He turned to the mother and worked faster. Fingers numb now, rope fibers burning his skin, freeing legs and torso until he could pull the bag from her head. She sucked air, hard, eyes wild, then focused on him, on the puppy, and her body surged with a strength that surprised even her, pushing to her feet despite the shock. Ethan raised a hand, palm open, not commanding, just present, the way he'd learned to be with men on the edge of panic. She hesitated, then allowed him the inches he needed to finish cutting the last knot. The horn sounded again, impossibly close, and Ethan scooped the puppy fully into his arms, pivoted and motioned with his shoulder. The mother followed, limping but determined, and together they cleared the rail as the train roared past in a hurricane of iron and wind that stole the air from the world. When the noise finally tore away, the silence that followed was enormous. Ethan sank back on his heels, breath shuddering, the puppy pressed to his chest, the mother standing guard at his side, sides heaving, eyes never leaving the child. From the far end of the yard, boots crunched on gravel. A woman approached at a careful distance, hands, visible posture, cautious without being afraid. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with the kind of wiry strength that came from long shifts and older responsibilities. Auburn hair escaped a knit cap in loose waves, skin pale and freckled from winters spent outdoors. Her name, she offered softly, was Sarah Mitchell, a railroad signal technician who'd worked these lines since she was 19, who'd learned to listen for trouble in metal the way others listened for weather. Years earlier, a coupling failure had taken her brother's leg and sharpened her voice into something precise. She spoke now with that same care, words measured, eyes kind. She knelt when she saw the dog, swore once under her breath, and shrugged out her heavy coat without asking, draping it over the mother's shoulders like an apology the place itself could not make. "Train's clear," she said, glancing back down the line, then to Ethan. "I called it in. Vet's 10 minutes out. Animal control too." Ethan nodded, jaw-tight gratitude flickering and gone as his attention returned to the puppy whose shaking had softened into a fragile rhythm. He checked gums, counted breaths, pressed warmth where it mattered. The mother lowered herself slowly close enough to touch the puppy with her nose, a quiet woof escaping her throat that was not a growl but a vow. Ethan felt the familiar pull to disappear after the job was done, to leave before anyone could ask him to explain the way his hands knew what to do. But Sarah's presence grounded the moment. She watched without hovering, offered a thermos when she saw the tremor in his fingers, and said nothing when he declined. Headlights swept the yard and a van rolled in its tires, crunching to a stop. Dr. Hannah Collins stepped out briskly, mid-30s, compact and purposeful, dark hair, braided tight against the cold olive skin flushed from the drive. Years in emergency clinics had taught her to triage without drama, and she took in the scene in seconds, voice calm as she assessed pupils, airway circulation. She wrapped the puppy in foil-lined blankets, murmured steady reassurances to the mother as she injected a fast-acting sedative measured to calm without stealing awareness, and met Ethan's eyes with a nod that said she saw the care in his work. As they loaded the dogs, the mother hesitated, then pressed her head briefly against Ethan's knee, a weight and warmth that lingered even after she was gone. Ethan stood alone again by the tracks, coat dusted with gravel, heart still racing, knowing the night had changed shape around him and that whatever had been left here to die had also left something behind. The clinic lights were too bright for the hour, a clean white that flattened the night into something clinical and unforgiving, and Ethan Walker stood beneath them with his hands washed raw, feeling the echo of the tracks still vibrating through his bones. Missoula slept outside the glass snow ticking softly against the windows, while inside the small emergency ward, the air smelled of antiseptic and warm fur. Dr. Hannah Collins moved with quiet efficiency between stainless tables, her compact frame steady, her dark braid resting between her shoulders like a line drawn with intention. She spoke in a low, even register that calmed animals and people alike, a habit earned during years of late-night emergencies when panic could kill faster than injury. The German shepherd Mother Grace lay sedated, but aware, her chest rising with a controlled rhythm, pupils tracking sound. The puppy Leo was bundled in layered blankets, his breathing thin but improving, a pulse strong enough now to trust. Ethan watched from a respectful distance, shoulders squared, yet restrained the way he'd learned to stand when the work was done, but the outcome still undecided. He felt relief, yes, but it was braided with something sharper, a delayed anger that arrived only after danger passed, anger at the hands that tied knots with patience and left living beings to metal and speed. Sarah Mitchell waited near the door, her borrowed quiet settling back over her tall, lean frame. She had stayed because leaving felt wrong, because the rails had taught her that witnesses mattered. She offered coffee from a paper cup, her freckled face drawn but composed auburn hair escaping its cap in tired curls. Ethan accepted this time, the warmth grounding him. Hannah approached with a chart, eyes intent but kind. "They'll live," she said, not triumphant, just factual. Hypothermia compression injuries, panic-induced oxygen deprivation. No fractures. The mother's resilient. The pup's lucky. Lucky, Ethan thought, considering the precise knots and the measured distance from the rail. Hannah continued. "Animal control will file the report. Police, too. Someone did this deliberately." The word landed with weight. Deliberate. Ethan nodded, jaw tightening, the memory of ordered retreats and planned harms stirring. As if summoned by the conversation, the door opened again, and a man stepped in with the careful authority of someone used to being unwelcome. Officer Mark Reyes was mid-30s, average height, broad through the chest from years in uniform, his dark hair clipped short, beard neatly trimmed to soften a face marked by sharp angles, and a small scar along the left cheek, a souvenir from a domestic call that went sideways early in his career. He had learned to keep his voice gentle without losing firmness, a balance forged by cases that followed him home. He introduced himself, simply, eyes moving from Ethan to the dogs with a flash of controlled anger. "We'll need statements," he said, "and timestamps." Ethan gave his account succinctly, facts over flourish, while Reyes listened without interruption, nodding once at the mention of the knots. "Sailor's knots," Reyes murmured, or someone who learned from one. Ethan met his gaze, a shared understanding passing without accusation. When it was done, the officer promised updates he might not be able to deliver and left boots whispering across tile. The hour deepened. Hannah finished her checks and dimmed the lights, allowing Grace to rest. Before stepping away, she placed Ethan's hand near the mother's shoulder. Grace shifted, pressed her nose against his wrist, then stilled, accepting him as part of the room. The contact startled him more than the train had. He stayed until the tremor left his hands, until Leo's breathing steadied into sleep. When he finally stepped outside, the cold met him like a verdict. He drove home along back roads, the night empty and vast, replaying the moment Grace had followed him off the track, choosing him without knowing him. At his small house on the edge of town, Pine, shadows stretched across the porch. Inside the rooms were spare wood table, couch with a blanket folded just so, boots aligned by the door, evidence of a man who kept his life light enough to move quickly. He sat at the table and let the silence speak, feeling the pull of responsibility settle where it had long been absent. He did not decide anything that night. He only acknowledged a truth he could no longer ignore. Some rescues did not end at the clinic door, and some shadows followed home because they needed a place to rest. Morning arrived thin and pale, the kind of Montana light that didn't warm so much as reveal. And Ethan Walker stood in his kitchen staring at a phone that had not rung, knowing it would, knowing he was already decided even before the sound came. The call arrived just after 8, Dr. Hannah Collins' voice steady and practical as she explained discharge timelines, temporary foster options, and the careful optimism of healing bodies paired with fragile trust. Ethan listened, eyes tracing the grain of the wooden table, and said yes before the questions finished forming. When he hung up, the word lingered in the room like a new piece of furniture. He drove to the clinic with the radio off, rehearsing nothing, letting the road teach him how to arrive. Grace met him awake, standing now with guarded confidence, her sable coat brushed and bandaged where rope had burned skin. She was lean adult, her strength not loud but persistent, eyes dark and observant, as if cataloging exits and intentions. Leo was louder, a 5-month-old tangle of paws and curiosity black and tan fur fluffed tail, wagging with the optimism of the unbroken. Though his movements were cautious, his ribs still too visible beneath the blanket, Hannah tucked around him. Hannah handed over instructions with the gentle authority of someone used to people promising more than they knew how to give. She watched Ethan's hands, saw the care there, and softened. Routine, she said. Quiet. Patience. Outside, Sarah Mitchell waited by her truck, tall and wiry in a denim jacket, auburn hair braided down her back against the cold. She smiled without cheerfulness, a practical kindness born of long days. "I'll check the lines by your place," she said, as if this were the most normal extension of the week. "Make sure you're not surprised." Ethan thanked her, a brief nod that held more than words. The drive home was slower than the night before. Grace stood in the back, braced Leo pressed into Ethan's jacket when the road dipped the car, filling with new sounds, a huff, a sniff, the soft click of nails on rubber matting. At the house, Grace paused at the threshold, head low, body angled, to protect the pup, assessing the space as a battlefield she hoped would remain quiet. Ethan crouched, gave her time. She crossed on her own terms. Inside, the rooms changed immediately. The couch was no longer just a place to sit. It became a perimeter. The kitchen bowl became a truce. Ethan moved deliberately, speaking little, setting boundaries with the same calm he'd learned to use with men who carried their own storms. He laid out blankets, opened windows, a finger's width cooked simple food. When Leo explored, Grace tracked him, then settled exhaustion, finally claiming her. By noon, a knock sounded. Officer Mark Reyes stood on the porch, uniform, neat expression careful. He carried a folder and the quiet weight of updates that rarely satisfied. He explained leads without promising justice, spoke of knots and timelines of a suspect who knew trains and chose places without cameras. His voice was measured, his eyes frank. "We'll keep at it," he said. "You did the right thing." After he left, Ethan felt the house breathe again. The afternoon stretched. Leo discovered a sock and declared victory. Grace watched from the rug, ears flicking the corner of her mouth, lifting in something like relief. A neighbor waved from across the fence, a small kindness, no questions asked. As evening fell, snow began again, soft and persistent, and Ethan realized the house had learned new sounds, the sigh of a settling dog, the scrape of a bowl, the quiet chaos of life choosing to stay. He sat on the floor with his back to the couch, Grace close enough to touch Leo asleep against his leg, and felt the unfamiliar ache of responsibility settle into something steadier. This was not a vow. It was a beginning shaped by ordinary hours, and it held. Spring did not announce itself in Missoula. It arrived the way healing often does, quietly, and then all at once, with snow pulling back into narrow seams along the yard, and light lingering longer on the pine trunks behind Ethan Walker's house. Weeks had passed, measured not by calendars but by small victories. Grace choosing the rug by the window as her post, Leo's ribs rounding under a growing appetite the first night Ethan slept through, without jolting awake to imagined horns. The house had learned a rhythm, and so had he. Ethan moved through mornings with a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. Beard trimmed now, eyes still watchful, but softer at the edges, the hard angles of his face easing as responsibility replaced vigilance. Grace's coat shone again, sable darkened by health, her stride confident adult, and composed a shepherd who knew her ground. She was 5 by Hannah's estimate, old enough to carry memory, young enough to relearn trust. Leo was a comet, 7 months now, black and tan fur, flying paws too big for his body. Optimism unashamed. He chased light and leaves and the echo of Ethan's laugh, which surprised them both the first time it escaped. Dr. Hannah Collins came by on a Saturday, dressed down in a wool sweater braid, loosened olive skin warmed by the sun. She examined stitches that had become scars and smiled the small, satisfied smile of a professional who knew when to step back. "They're home," she said simply. Sarah Mitchell stopped by later with a box of oranges and a story about a signal upgrade that would quiet the line near the old yard. Tall and lean, auburn hair bright in the thaw. She watched Grace watch the horizon and nodded as if acknowledging a sentry relieved. Officer Mark Reyes called, with news that was careful but real charges filed, a suspect identified through knots and timelines, and while justice would take its own patient road, the certainty lifted a weight Ethan hadn't realized he carried. On a Sunday afternoon, neighbors gathered at the fence without ceremony, a shared wave, a bowl of water set down, an understanding that some stories needed no retelling. A boy named Caleb from 2 houses over 10 years old, freckled Ernest, asked if he could toss a ball. Ethan watched Grace assess the child, then step aside, granting permission. The ball flew. Leo flew after it. Laughter stitched the air. That evening, as light thinned to gold, Ethan sat on the porch with Grace at his knee, Leo asleep across his boots, and considered the shape of the days ahead. He had not planned this life, but it fit. The war had taught him how to leave. These dogs were teaching him how to stay. When the distant train passed, muted, now Grace lifted her head and then settled, the sound no longer a command. Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder, feeling the quiet strength there, and knew that hope did not require grand gestures, only presence chosen again and again. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the heavens. Sometimes they come quietly disguised as a moment of courage, a hand that chooses not to turn away, or a heart that stays open when the world has shown its cruelty. In the space between fear and action, God often works through ordinary people, through compassion, through choice, through love that refuses to abandon the vulnerable. Grace and Leo were not saved by chance alone. They were saved because someone listened when his conscience spoke, and in that listening God's mercy found a path into the world. In our everyday lives, we stand at our own tracks more often than we realize. A neighbor in need, a wounded soul, a moment when silence would be easier than kindness. These are the places where faith becomes real, not in words, but in what we choose to do next. When we act with love, even in small ways, we become part of a miracle meant for someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from or what this story reminded you of. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of compassion, courage, and redemption. And may God bless you, protect you, and fill your days with light. May His grace walk with you on every road you travel, and may you never doubt that love, when chosen, can change a life.